Greetings, my fellow knights. Tonight we will feel what it was like to be a Roman emperor on campaign, to ride with the legions, hear the clash of armor at dawn, and carry the burden of command as the empire's fate rests on your shoulders. This immersive history was created based on two key works: Paul Veyne's book, What Was a Roman Emperor, and Patricia Southern's book, The Roman Empire, From Severus to Constantine. Their research helps us step closer into the world of the emperor and the armies he led. But before you drift into comfort, I ask you, as a fellow knight of these tales, to like and subscribe, and in the comments share what other period of history you would like to experience. Now steady your horse and raise the standard. The campaign begins. Chapter 1. Camp on the Danube. Our story begins in a legionary camp on the Danube. Imagine you are the Roman emperor in the year 172, walking a steady path between stakes and tents, while the Praetorian Guard keeps close and the smell of wood smoke settles into your cloak. The ground underfoot is firm, the lines straight, and the day carries on in an orderly way, because order keeps worry small. There will be talk later of great deeds and sudden storms of steel, but the truth starts with plain things and quiet steps. Soon enough, riders will churn the river, and a siege will press your will against the hard choice of blood or hunger. That is what people remember, and they forget how many hours were calm. But for now, the gate stands watched, the ditch holds true, and men see that their emperor walks among them. It is a simple act, and it steadies more hearts than a fine speech. A nod to a centurion here, a word of praise there, and faces relax, which is half of victory. You feel the weight of the crown more like a coat than a chain on such days, and that is a good way to wear it. Take each hour as it comes, and the hours gather into a road. A camp like this runs because many hands turn the same wheel, each hand sure of its place, each place tied to the next. Sappers check stakes and make small fixes where rain had taken a bite, while a clerk counts the mules and notes which harness looks tired. A tribune moves along the main street, careful and calm, so the men learn by watching more than by being told. The Praetorian Guard keeps a ring around the heart of the camp, not far and not near, and that distance speaks without a raised voice. The truth of command is not thunder, it is the gentle pull of a rope that does not snap. Rank matters, but a man matters too, and steady eyes are worth more than gold on a belt when lines must hold. The work never feels grand while it is done, though it holds the ground under tomorrow. A faint creak from a worn strap reminds that even small things need care, and that was the way of things. When an emperor looks at small things, big troubles shrink a little. Many think a purple cloak means ease and couches, but the work of a ruler on campaign is closer to a long march than a feast. The mind must be fit, and the hands must not fear tasks that seem small, because the men will see the truth better than the myths. A line of shields will move because the one at the front keeps a clear face, and the one at the center keeps a clear head. A word to a tribune binds officers into one voice, and one voice carries farther than many shouted orders. This is not a stage, and there is no curtain to hide behind after a mistake. There is only the next step and the next choice. The rough grain of a camp table met the palm as notes were placed in order, and that grip on simple wood felt honest, which mattered. Some days have a bright story, but most days have a plain one, and plain days keep men alive. In time, the stories grow from those plain hours, not from the flashes others like to tell. That was the truth learned again with each morning. Food and chores kept the shape of the day, while plans ripened in quiet talk. A simple share of bread and a spoon of barley porridge could do more for a mood than talk of glory, because empty bellies do not think well. A comrade from long service stood near and spoke of a village upstream, not as a scout giving a report, but as a man laying out a path by memory. It was good to listen, because listening turns strangers into help. A smith worked not far off, and a carpenter checked wagons, each man sure in his trade, and that web of old skills held fast where speeches could not. The steam from a cook's pot brushed the cheek when passing by the line, a small warmth that felt like a promise that the night would pass, and nights always do. To accept small comforts without shame is part of the burden of leading, because even emperors need steady hands and steady meals. The men watch how such things are taken, and they copy that habit in hard hours. That is how a camp keeps its spirit without the noise of trumpets. Between short walks there were words to set in order, and petitions to weigh with care. Not every request could be granted, yet each deserved to be read without haste, for fairness keeps strong backs from turning bitter. A legate waited by the entrance flap and kept his face even, which is the sign of a man who carried messages through rain and worse without letting the fear leak into his voice. Decisions made in calm do not look brave, but they give the bravery room to stand when it is needed. The stylus made a soft scratch on wax as names and notes were marked, and that small sound was a promise to keep track of the people behind the numbers. It is easy to point and demand. It is harder to weigh and answer. The day grew by inches with these small choices, and the path through the next week slowly appeared, not as a cliff, but as a slope that could be climbed. A leader does not need to be loud to be firm. A steady tone becomes a wall the rain cannot wear down. That has always been the better way. Evening brought the watch to their places and the heart of the camp back into one small circle. The Praetorian Guard marked the routes between stakes, and the officer at the gate checked the watchword with a quiet nod that did not shame a tired tongue. A runner from the river spoke of the far bank without drama, and that lack of fire in the telling gave the news more weight. The mind weighed not only what was said, but also what was left out, for gaps can be as loud as cries. The torch at the headquarters threw a steady glow across polished cuirass and plain cloak alike, a little island of light that stood for order when the hour grew late. Trust is built there, one measured count at a time, until a glance can do the work of a speech. Some think fear builds quicker ranks, but fear breaks fast, while trust bends and returns. The guards' spears stood like markers in a shared field, each one a pledge more than a threat. That was the sense worth keeping, as the day thinned out. As the sky darkened, small knots of men told stories, tossed bones for luck, and sang lines they knew from boys' days, while the older hands kept the jokes gentle. An emperor does not sit high and far. He stands near enough that laughter finds him, and near enough that a hard stare can end a bad turn before it starts. The gods were thanked in simple words, not because of fear, but because gratitude keeps a heart from drying out. A few lines to Mars were spoken without fuss, and even that had a calm shape to it, like a gate swung shut for the night. Work keeps a man steady, but so do these bits of ease, and to bless them is not weakness. A low hum rose from a far corner where a tune kept time with easy hands, and that little rise and fall wrapped the camp like a blanket. It is wise to let such sounds run their course without making a show of it. The line between ruler and man should be firm, but it should not be a wall. That was the balance learned and learned again. Night made the river into a dark thread beyond the last row of stakes, and thoughts settled into straight lines as the last tasks closed. There would be riders soon, and a siege might test the gate and the stomach, and the Danube would be a path, not a shield. Still the mind held to a simple truth. Steady steps shrink hard miles, and steady words calm a fearful heart. A hand rested on the map, only long enough to confirm what was already known, because confidence born of careful work is the right kind. A faint mist lay beyond the palisade, and promised a cool dawn that would show tracks and paths with honest light, and that was enough for the night. Tomorrow the red vexillum would lift where the main street meets the open ground, and the first orders would be set in plain speech. Calm would do the heavy work, as it had done today. The camp, for all its sawdust and chores, had given what was needed. Sleep could come without guilt, and morning would be met standing. That is how the next chapter begins. Chapter 2. Morning Orders. You rose before dawn, and felt the day waiting like a held breath, steady and patient. The camp had rested well enough, and the guards had done their rounds without fuss, which was what mattered most before a march. A basin sat in the corner of the tent, and a simple cloth lay folded beside it. Hands were washed, face freshened, and the cloak found its place across the shoulders. The chill bit at the fingers, a small reminder that spring near the river kept its edge. A Praetorian nodded without a word, as the door flap lifted, and the path to the command ground lay clear in front. Work began before the sun, because the sun did not care for a late plan. A few simple ideas were repeated in the mind. Keep the line moving, keep the men fed, keep the fear small. That was the rule that outlasted any speech. A day like this often started with small, plain acts. A buckle was checked, a thought was set. That was the way of things. When calm was the first order, the tribune waited near the standard where the ground was marked off for the morning talk. and the steps between were measured and sure. He greeted with the direct look of a man who had slept too little but was ready to serve. Questions hung, but only the important ones mattered. So a hand lifted, and the talk began in simple words. The vexillum hung red and still above the place where the plans were made, a quiet mark to gather eyes. The gist was clear: move light, keep watches tight, hold the pace. The Tribune took it in with a slow nod, as if weighing the path ahead stone by stone. He asked once more about scouts and supply, and the answer came the same, steady and fair. Orders did not need polish to be strong. They needed to be understood the first time. The lad took the meaning, and duty settled on him like a mantle. That was how a morning held its shape. Senior men came up as called, and each took a place in a small half-circle, which kept the talk close and the minds closer. A list of posts was given without strain. The first cohort would set the march, and the second would take the wagons, and so on, until every gap felt covered. The scribe marked names and tasks, while the Tribune watched in case a change came to mind. A murmur rose and fell as officers repeated the lines to those behind them, a soft track that showed the plan had started to move. A centurion asked about the fords, and patience met the question while a map edge was tapped. There would be a look ahead, sent early, and a signal if the water ran high. No one was blamed for asking. Men did better when they could see a path. This was known from many seasons. A few last points were settled, not with force, but with the calm that made people listen. Bread was taken and broken with a plain knife, since a body served better with something in it. The talk during that bite stayed light. A few words about sick lists, a few about stoves and tents, nothing more. The Tribune stood by and waited for the next note, careful not to hurry a thing best done in order. The taste of plain bread sat simple on the tongue, enough to remind that the stomach had limits and would complain later if ignored. A runner came, brought a small warning about a petty theft, and left as quick as he came. The matter was held, not rushed, and the centurion over the quartermaster's line was told to sort it. When people knew bad conduct was handled without shouting, they trusted that the rest would be handled too. A leader did not need big shows. A leader needed clean, small acts that made the day steady. That truth stayed useful in every season. Then came the inspection of the first posts, the watch near the gate, the line where the day's detail formed, and the few men assigned to the engineers. They stood straight, helmets set right, faces steady the way soldiers kept them when eyes were on them. Nothing great was asked of them then, only the habit of care, straps mended, loads balanced, tempers kept in place. A thin line of light slipped along the eastern rim as if to tip its hat to the camp, and that made the hour clear without a word. The Tribune repeated the plan to a young officer who would carry a message to the rear wagons. A small hard knot of worry sat in every morning, and a small calm voice was the knife to cut it loose. That was why the day began with order. It spared a great deal of trouble later. The men understood this, even when they pretended not to. Petitions came next, because morning was the only time people could be heard before the march pulled minds apart. A veteran asked to be settled closer to his brother's tent so he could keep an eye on a cough. A cook wanted 2 more hands for the midday pot, and a scout hoped for a new mount when his failed at the last ford. Each case was weighed, and each answer was set down with care, not only for fairness, but to show that fairness was the habit. The smell of damp wool rose from the cloaks of the petitioners as they waited their turn, a small proof that the night had sat heavy on the camp. A leader's patience helped, even when the talk ran long. Most troubles shrank once someone listened. That was a small truth, but it saved harsh orders later. People stood straighter when they felt seen. At last the signal for assembly was given, and the ranks shaped themselves with the ease that came from drill more than pride. Words were spoken so all could hear, one point after another, but without rush. The pace would be even, the rear would keep close, the scouts would ride ahead by measured spans, and the wagons would not lag. A single clear horn note cut the air and held for a breath, and then fell away so the voice could do the rest. One thing was added so no one forgot. Spear shafts and pylon heads were to be checked before the line moved, not during it. That was not clever, it was plain sense. The new men needed to hear it. The old men needed to hear it again. A leader repeated what mattered, even when it sounded simple. That kept luck on friendly terms. When the last word was said, the circle broke apart, and the tent stood quiet enough to write a few lines and mark the day. A map waited on the table with small stones where roads crossed, and one more stone was set to guide a messenger if something turned. Simple habits kept the mind neat, even when trouble lurked behind easy days. The warmth of a cup rested in both hands for a slow moment, and that pause set the breath right for what came next. Not every hour had to shout to prove it mattered. Calm work in the morning made the march in the afternoon lighter. That was how good days earned their names. With the plans settled and the men in their places, the mind leaned north toward the road and its steady dust, ready to let the column move in order when the time came. Chapter 3. The Long Road North. The column moved north at first light, past open fields and tall trees. With carts rolling and men in steady lines, the staff kept to the center, while a few riders moved along the sides to watch the edges of the road. An emperor did not need to speak much on such a day, only to be seen, and to let calm be the main signal. Legionaries eased the iron heads of the pilum from straw-wrapped bundles on the wagons and held them low, not because a fight was near, but because the road bent and caution was a simple habit. Dust rose from dry ground and sat on the tongue like chalk, and a small swallow of water made only a small change. A mule kicked once and then settled, which drew a few short smiles and made the miles feel less heavy. The land ahead felt like a long thought one meant to finish, and a leader helped others carry it by not making it look hard. The pace stayed the same, one foot and then the other, the sort of rhythm that made worry give up. That was the way long marches worked when order stayed firm and the day kept its shape. Signals moved down the line without fuss, a lifted hand here, a clear word there, and gaps closed before they opened wider. The main task was to hold a pace that fit both men and animals, which was simpler said than done with so many from different corners. A few veterans kept the front honest, and new men watched their boots and counted steps until the count itself felt like a friend. A clerk rode near and noted small changes for the record, not because paper ruled the march, but because memory liked help. Carts stayed to the right, riders to the edges, and walking men took the middle and kept shoulder to shoulder, so the road stayed smooth. From time to time, a light jest passed between ranks, the kind that showed old hands were still steady. The creak of harness and wheels marked the miles like a slow drum, and it set a calm frame on the whole day. It was not grand, but grand things rarely carried a load so well. There was comfort in ordinary sounds and simple order, and that comfort kept fear small. A scout pointed out a narrow stretch ahead, so officers sent word to thin the files and lengthen the line, then close again after the bend. A leader rode to the bottleneck and let the men see a quiet face, which was all they needed to keep the pace even. When puddles cropped up from last week's rain, a path around was set with a hand wave and a nod, so boots stayed dry enough for the next mile. In a long day, small choices stopped small pains before they turned large. Now and then, a shield edge rubbed a thigh, and the bearer shifted it without a word and went on, the kind of fix that needs no order. A beam of noon light glanced off a row of scutum faces in one bright run, and it held for a breath before the trees took it back. A man at the rear called for patience when a wheel slipped, and patience came because someone had lit it earlier. Calm grew by seeing it, not saying it. That was always true on a road that had many eyes watching one pair of hands. They ate at the second halt when the sun had climbed a bit, and the animals needed a rest. Bread came out of bags with a slow knife, and a slice of hard cheese sat on top, which was enough for the next stretch. A young soldier measured his share with care, and an older one cut a little more from his own and pushed it across without a word. A leader watched without stepping in. Kindness did not need a stage. A few sips of water were taken, and the skins were tied shut right away, since thirst on the road grew by carelessness first. The break lasted only as long as it should, and a small measure of quiet talk fit into it, the sort that reminded men of home without pulling them apart from the task. The smell of warm bread clung around the group for a short while, and then it left as the march began again. It was the same as many days, which was its own kind of strength. Routines like this kept the mind from chewing itself, and that mattered more than one might guess. After midday, the land rose a little, then sank again, a slow roll that made the work steady rather than sharp. The staff sent word to change the order of burden, so men who had carried all morning handed a pack to those who had not, and the weight found a new set of backs. A leader felt the duty in that trade and kept an eye on faces rather than numbers, since where showed there first. Officers at the flanks checked that no one drifted too far to pick berries or wander after a thought, and brought them back with a nod rather than a shout. A rider went ahead to look for a clean place to stop at next, one with a bit of space and a firm path out. Care took many small forms, and each of them spared a larger one later. The strap of a cloak pressed at the collarbone by afternoon, and fingers eased it and settled it again before the ache grew sharp. Everyone knew the trick, and everyone used it. That was how long miles were shared rather than suffered, and why tempers stayed whole. As the hours passed, small jokes did their work better than orders. A veteran told a harmless story about a market in a distant town, and a young man tried to add a brave end to it, which earned him a grin and nothing harsher. A leader drifted near the tail, and then away again, pleased to see that the tail had a life without help. The cart masters checked their ropes and knots and tightened what had worked loose, because carts like to tell their own stories if ignored. A pair of officers reviewed the next turning and set a marker so the tail would not miss it, and the plan moved down the line with no fanfare. Everyone knew that worry grows in the gaps between one group and the next. A low tune began in the middle ranks, slow and plain, and it held to one note long enough to pull breath and step together. Music like that did not win a battle, but it carried men to the ground where a battle might be won. It eased minds, which was worth a great deal. Late afternoon brought signs of farms again, and with them the thought of wells, which lifted heads in a quiet way. A rider came back from the point with word that a proper ford lay not far ahead, and that the banks there were firm. The staff checked the maps that rode in memory rather than on a board, and confirmed the choice, then sent messengers to shorten the gaps between the main parts of the column. The plan was to reach the ground before dusk, see it well, and then decide how the morning should start. A cartwheel cracked, but the men with it had a spare and hands ready, so delay never had a chance to grow. A young soldier asked if they would pitch a full camp or a tight one, and the answer was simple: it would be enough, and not more, because enough keeps men fresh. The line saw a thin pillar of smoke far ahead from a small hut, which told them people lived near and paths crossed there. Such signs were read without fuss. Practice taught everyone what to look for, and practice kept talk short and useful. Dusk neared as the broad line drew toward the river ground, and officers passed the word to close ranks and keep to the main track. A leader rode along the front and let eye contact take the place of long speech, since tired men understand glances better than lectures. The field by the bank was as good as could be hoped, but even so, no one took more room than was needed. Fires were set small and spread out, not for fear, but to keep the camp easy to move in the morning. Guards were posted without trouble. Habit set them in place before night made choices vague. Wagons formed a neat line to break the night wind and to make a place where tools could be found quickly if needed. The river ran close with a patient sound, steady and even, and its pace seemed to set the pace in camp. Food came again in simple form, and talk dropped to a low level that kept company without tiring minds. This was the careful end of a careful day, and it was enough. Chapter 4: Crossing the River. By midday, the river ran broad and steady, and the near bank held a line of patient men who had done this kind of work before. The order for the crossing had been given while the scouts watched the far trees, and the ranks waited by habit more than ease as measures were checked. The shield wall was drawn up along the water so the builders could move without worry, with narrow gaps left for boats and lines to pass through when the word came. Cold spray touched the left cheek when the wind slipped across the current, a small sting that kept the mind awake. Standards stood behind the front files, but no show was made. This was work, not parade, and every man understood that plain fact. A sign from the officer at the bank sent the first crew to the moorings, and ropes were taken in hand with care so no twist spoiled the start. You raised an arm, let it fall, and the nearest line moved in time, the habit of many months guiding feet and breath without fuss. There had been many roads behind, yet a river made a man face himself, and that truth asked for quiet rather than noise. Fear had its place, but order pressed it down to size, and that was the way of things on days when the Empire asked for more than words. Engineers had worked through the night to lash planks to riverboats, and morning brought more hands to the task because a span did not build itself. The plan had been simple and well used. Boats were set in line, planks were fixed, and long poles were made ready to hold the run straight against the pull. The shield wall along the bank adjusted with each step, shields pressed edge to edge, knees bent a little, bodies settled into that patient crouch. Soldiers learn when water is near. A rank of chosen men guarded the openings and closed them at a word, so no gaps stayed bare for long. Near the rise, the ballista sat on a low frame, its crew moving with steady care, so the arm would not spend strength before the call. An officer took the measure of the far bend and marked the least broken water, and messengers carried the marks to the builders so no move went astray. The sharp smell of hot pitch hung over the planks while caulking was checked and checked again, a plain reminder that water never forgave hurry. The mind stayed on simple things, knots and spacing, because simple things kept a man from wandering thoughts that led nowhere good. It was not hero's work, yet it saved lives, and that was enough to honor in quiet, which was the right way to honor most things. At the first sign from the hill, the heavy machine was cranked down and set, and the crew stood clear with the calm that came from habit. You lifted 2 fingers, then 1, then pointed along the water, and the arm came forward with a single deep thump that carried across the span in one steady note. The bolt took a slice of reed at the far edge and buried itself near the bank, which was enough for the purpose, for men think twice about a rush when such things land close. The first boat pushed out with a file aboard, and the second followed at a fixed space so nothing crowded or tangled in the pull. An officer kept count by habit, and the measure held true as poles bit and eased to hold the line. The shield wall at the near bank shifted a step to keep the builders covered, and a second line stood ready behind them in case the day turned rough. Every part found its calm pace, and in that calm the worry about the deep and the hidden was made to sit down and be still. The crossing was never a trick, only work, and work could be made safe when places were kept and orders stayed short, which was how armies lived together. Across the river, figures showed along the brush in broken patches, and a few moved back and forth as if testing nerve more than distance. A small group stepped to a fallen tree and looked our way, but no rush was made, which was a gift no one spoke about while the span grew. A bright glint flashed once from a helm rim above the brush, and then was still again, a thin wink that said they watched as close as we did. The plan allowed for that, since watchers did not break a bridge unless fools gave them a chance to. The front line raised shields and sank a little, and the men at the machine waited for the sign to send another warning if any bold soul tried a probe. The boats kept the same careful space and made a flat arc toward the least broken bend, which had been chosen for depth and for the ground beyond. A comrade near the water kept the picket rope tight so no drift began, and the crew in the second boat kept their eyes on his hands for the next pull. Patience held as well as wood and rope, and patience came from drill, which was why days like this were spent counting and waiting rather than shouting. Most days. Midstream, a boat swung a hand's width off the line when a knot bit wrong, and the polesman worked it back as if moving a stubborn mule. The crew on the second boat took the strain, and the rope eased true again, which was the sort of small wind that kept hands steady without pride. The men at the front lifted their scuttum higher to guard the workers, and the second line closed the gap a half step so nothing showed through. You stepped to the edge when the boat came near, and gave a calm word to hold the pace, which did more than a shout ever could in a place like this. The weight of a wet cloak pulled at the shoulders after a gust found the river's skin, and that small drag told how the day would ask for patience rather than speed. A runner brought word that a narrow shelf ran close below the far bank, and so a longer plank was sent to bridge the last reach without a scramble. Each move stayed plain, and each order stayed short, and the river answered better for it, as rivers did when treated without pride or hurry. In that way the middle was passed, and the far half lay open to quiet work for us all there. The first boat reached the shelf as planned, and the men stepped down to make a small half-ring that faced the brush while they waited for help to fill the line. A low ridge of earth gave a little cover, and stakes were set to mark where the span would meet the bank so the flow would not push it off. A second file joined and lengthened the ring until it made a short front with a bend at each end, and care was taken to leave room for the next boats to slip in without fouling the order. A signal from the hill sent the machine to speak again, not to strike anyone but to make thinking harder on the other side, which was what machines did best on such days. A flat taste of the river sat on the tongue and would not leave. A reminder that water found a way into every plan if it was not watched. There was no rush to chase anyone. The The work was to hold a door open so the rest could come across without being cut in pieces. It seemed a small thing, yet small things like a door held firm were the start of whole roads and whole years. The thought kept anger in check and turned it into care, which was the wiser course when lives were in the hands of steady labor. Once the door stood held, more files crossed at a measured pace, and the bridge grew true one piece at a time, while officers kept the count. A second span of boats was set a little upstream to take the wear, and the first was left to carry the foot while the second bore tools and the last of the heavy gear. The smell of wet reeds rose when the bank was cut back to marry plank and earth, a clean green note that told the place was still more river than road. The far front lengthened to a straight line, and men began to edge forward by pairs so no weak point was offered to the brush. A small troop of horse waited until the span was firm, and only then picked its path across, because hooves broke what men did not defend. The machine on the near rise stayed idle now, and the crews set their hands to the ropes to help the builders pull the last pieces home. It was the sort of turn that marked the end of risk, not because strength rose, but because care had done the heavy lifting first. The day had asked for order, and order had been given, and that is how hard things were done when pride was kept in check. By late light, the far bank held a stout front and a narrow camp behind it, and the builders made the span neat so it would last the night. Men counted their pairs and found most faces where they should be, and a steady calm ran through the ranks while small chores began. A clerk came with a tablet and took note of the work and the hours, not to make anyone famous, but to see that tomorrow's loads and shares would be fair. The warmth of a small brazier pressed into the palms when hands were held out over the coals, a comfort that told the body it had come through and could ease for a while. You sat with one officer and spoke about early watches and the plan for the morning, and both of you kept to short words because short words were enough. Thoughts turned to pay, grain, and letters, since men worked better when their lot was clear and their homes were heard from, and that was simple truth. The river behind had been crossed without fuss beyond what was needed, and the land ahead would be taken the same way, with steady steps. The night would pass under good order, and in the morning the same calm would be laid over the camp as it always should be. Chapter 5. Pay, Grain, and Letters. The day after the crossing, the command tent became a plain room of work, and the legate sat across with a wax tablet between. The table had marks from old knives and hurried meals, but it did its duty without pride. A harness hung from a peg near the flap, and the smell of oil from its straps drifted in and out as the cloth moved. The guard outside shifted his boots now and then, but inside the talk stayed low. It was the hour when a camp waited on numbers, and numbers needed calm hands. The legate lifted his chin and named cohorts and stores, and the words carried more weight than any cheer. A small purse lay by the tablet, unopened until the sums were sure. The days of riding hard had passed for a time, and this was the next task that held the line together. It was never grand work, but it kept food in mouths and worry from rising too high. Fairness set roots deeper than force, and the men felt it, even if they never spoke of it. That was the way of things when command wanted the next march to go smooth. Figures were put down with care, while the stylus made a quiet scratch across the wax, gentle as a broom across a swept stone. The legate named the century and the state of its mules, and a clerk near the pole waited for each nod before he wrote the same line on his tablet. A centurion ducked in and asked after a delayed parcel from home, and went out again when told it would be checked before night. It helped to keep the line of talk simple and the questions plain, because men trusted plain speech when their thoughts were bent by hunger and long steps. Promises stayed small and clear. That was the safe size for promises out here. A number missed in spring could grow into anger by autumn, so the tablet held more than marks. The work was slow and steady, and that steadiness was the shield the camp needed on a quiet day that still mattered. When the chest was opened, the pay did not flash or sing. The weight of the denarii in a leather purse sat heavy in the hand like a river stone. A guard stood by with his gladius at his side, not to threaten, but to remind that order had a body as well as a voice. The first purse went to a cohort that had taken the worst place at the bridge, and no one argued when that was said aloud. Then another share was set aside for the smiths who kept the nails and plates ready, because a wagon that rolled saved more backs than a speech. The legate watched each move and nodded when the scale balanced true. Gifts asked for special favor were set off to one side and written down to be weighed against service and need. Coins quieted talk, but justice won trust. Even an emperor had to respect that simple law. A camp with steady pay slept better, and better sleep made strong hearts the next morning. Grain came next, and the quartermaster brought his figures like a farmer with his measures. The mills on the bank had kept at it since dusk, and the fine dust of meal on the millman's fingers spoke of a good night's push. A wheel with a bent plank slowed the work, so a carpenter was sent with a mallet and plain nails to make it true again. It was not a matter for show, it was a matter for the loaf in a man's hand at noon. Stores were counted for mules and men, and the cooking sheds were told to stretch the stew with beans where they could without slighting the soldiers. One extra scoop for a cohort on outpost duty was allowed, and the note made next to their name so no one could claim a secret gift. Food was the first arm of an army, and calm meals kept hard talk from turning sharp. The legate's eye moved from line to line, and the tablet held the proof a camp needed to feel steady. Then came letters, a bundle bound in cord like small doors that would open into many rooms, and the rustle of parchment as it was untied sounded soft and busy. A courier from the south brought a stack from the Senate, and another from the governor of a river town begged for help with a broken ferry. A folded note from a widow in a hill village asked after a son who had left before harvest. The legate set it with care on a corner where it would not be lost. There were also short lines from a priest who kept the weather records, and a trader who offered mules if paid at once. Words were a different kind of march, and they had to be walked with the same even pace. Hard letters were not ducked, easy ones were not pushed off. A command worked best when every message found its place and did not float loose in the mind. That was how a leader kept the day from turning heavy. Replies were made in order, and a clerk warmed the seals while the thoughts were shaped into simple lines, and the taste of watered wine on the tongue kept the throat clear between sentences. The Senate received plain facts and a measured ask for grain barges, nothing more than needed and nothing less. Pride was a poor load for a boat. The town with the broken ferry was told when teams would come and how long the river would be watched while the work was done. The widow got a kind line and a mark to set her case aside until more could be learned, because a mother's worry deserved time even when the march pressed. A note to a tribune praised a cohort by name for steady duty at the bridge, and that small light would brighten a long week better than an extra shout on parade. Writing like this was quiet labor, but it shaped what steel could not shape. Words held a camp together where ropes and stakes could not reach. By mid-afternoon, a walk through the lines showed how the work in the tent poured into the ground, and the rich smell of stew rose from a cook fire and settled in the air like a gentle promise. A standard-bearer lifted his pole a little when the legate passed, and a file of men near the ditch leaned away from a dice game and stood because respect was a habit, not a show. A comrade beside the path asked for straw for a sore mule, and the note was made in the small tablet kept in the sleeve. A sergeant tried to make a joke about the heavy purse, and no answer was needed beyond a nod and a hint that extra guard posts would go to his lot if the joke turned into heat. Pay and food had reached the right hands, and that was better than any speech. The camp breathed easier when the ordinary held firm. That was how strength was stored for a day that might not be so kind. As the light softened, the last sums were checked, and the tablet was rubbed smooth where old lines were no longer needed, and the cool air on the face outside the tent felt clean after the warm hours of work. A messenger to the foraging parties was given a clear route and a warning about the marsh near the bend. The legate asked if anything had been left out, and the clerk read the small list of tasks to be done at dawn. No one wanted surprises. They tired a camp faster than distance. The guard at the flap eased his stance when told the watch times had been set. A steady day like this never carried glory, but it made glory possible when the hard days came. Tomorrow would test the order set here with quiet hands, and there was no need to fear that truth. Calm now would feed courage later, and that was a fair trade for a long afternoon at the table. Chapter 6. Ambush in the woods. The track narrowed where the forest closed in, and branches leaned over the marching heads like quiet hands. Orders had gone out to tighten the column and keep the intervals steady, because a line that held shape did not invite trouble. A scout came back with a look that told enough, and the walking pace slowed without a fuss. A hand rose and the files halted, shields tipped just so, and riders slipped to the edges to watch the ground. You took the measure of the trees, counted the gaps, and marked a slight swell where the path cut over a low mound. A calm voice told the front to brace, the rear to close, and the reserve to stand by. It was all drill laid down on a summer day brought to bear in a shaded place, which was how such work was meant to go. No heroics, only order, because order saved lives more often than strength did. Men looked to one another, found steadiness in simple tasks, and waited for a sign to act. The smell of wet leaves rose from the churned path and hung under the trunks, and it reminded tired minds that the earth did not care about pride, which was a helpful thought. The first rush came from the right, quick feet under brush, and a flash of movement in the ferns. A signal was raised and the front ranks set their feet, shields edged forward, and right arms pulled back as one. You gave the word, and a hard wave of castings swept from the path into the trees. The line throwing in 2 beats so the weight landed like a hammer, not a spray. There was no panic in it, because panic was a poor tool, and a poor tool broke when it met hard use. The line held, the interval to the next file kept open enough to move, and the reserve waited without chatter. It was the way drill was meant to live, not as words, but as a calm habit under strain. One horn call cut through the trees, clear and short, and that single sound fixed scattered thoughts on duty, which was the point of such small things. The second rank stepped past the first in the next breath, and steel showed close, because a rush met while still moving was easier to tame. You pointed to the ground to anchor the center, then sent a file to mark the left with a few quiet gestures that men knew well from practice. It felt like the edge of a table catching a cloth. Everything snagged, steadied, and then set. The first line took a half step back to make room, ready to move forward again when told, because turns like that kept the edges firm. The path became a thin road between tall trunks, and the press channeled into a place where numbers mattered less than order. Names did not carry a fight like this. Hands did, and they did so without fuss when the body remembered the work. The gladius worked in close spaces in a way that long reach could not match, and that was why daily drill had carved the motion into muscle. A palm slid along rough bark to brace a turn, and that one solid touch steadied the step, which was often how courage returned. The rush faltered where the push met steady weight, and a few figures tried to dart around the end to find the side. The reserve slid in like a door closing, and the end curled just enough to deny an easy way through. You kept your voice level, lifted a hand to hold a few paces, and then sent the next small block forward to keep the front fresh. There was a rhythm to it, like steady breathing, only learned by long days under a mild sun, so that it would show up under a heavy sky. An officer at your shoulder pointed with 2 fingers at a low dip behind a stump, and a nod sent a handful to guard it. Stories later would make it sound sudden and wild, but the truth lived in little steps done well. Men did not need fine speeches here. They needed clear space to move and a reason to trust the motion. The taste of iron touched the tongue where a lip had split, and the small sting brought focus back to simple tasks, which was a wiser use of pain than anger. There came a push on the left that felt like a test, quick and sharp, and the gap between 2 files showed thin for a breath. A short gesture sent the reserve to bend the line, and hands moved without tangle to make the shape hold. You waved a single rider to carry a calm word to the rear. Stand fast, keep the load still, and wait for the next call. No one ran, and no one tried to be a hero, and that was the best kind of bravery out here. The men at the bend held low and leaned into shields while the rest kept their own ground, because one part of a body did not need to move when another did the work. It was the same lesson as bread rationed fare, only now it was space and breath instead of loaves. A standard lifted above the shrubs, just enough for eyes to settle on, and with that simple marker, the heart steadied. The thud of boots on soft ground came in time with the line's small steps, and rhythm made fear smaller, which was why old soldiers valued it. The moment to close came when the weight of the rush wavered, and a still hand from you told the center to press without breaking shape. First the right stepped in, then the left matched, and the middle held firm, so the curve bit and straightened like a gate locking home. It was not a charge in the grand tail sense. It was a careful push that gathered men one by one and folded them back. A few slipped away between trunks, and that was fine because the work was not to chase, but to clear the path and keep the column whole. The gladius showed again in tight space, a short reach that wanted a calm heart and a clear head, and practice gave both. After a short press, the front eased back half a pace so the next file could take the strain, which was the old way to keep strong hands from shaking. The ring of iron filled the air as edges met and parted, and the steady clatter marked the work better than any words, which is often how truth sounds in such places. The line stood as one now, and the rush broke into small knots that fell away from the edges. A signal had the front stop moving forward and make room for the wounded to be brought out through small lanes, and steady men carried them without show. You sent a note down the path to loosen the rear and bring forward water skins, because a drink at the right time kept a man from thinking too far ahead. The quiet after a fight had its own weight, and it needed gentle hands to set it down. A few clumsy jokes started, and that helped more than many knew, since laughter led the mind back to normal things. Officers counted calmly, checked names, and set pickets among the stumps to keep surprises small. A few branches were cut to clear sightlines as the column gathered itself for the next step, and tasks like that put the world back in order. The smell of pine sap from the fresh cuts hung sweet and sharp, and that homely scent said the day would go on, which was the comfort needed. By the time the track opened a little, the choice was clear. Hold the men in shape, send a feeler forward, and let the woods empty themselves without being chased. There had been hard moments, but the line had not lost itself, and that was what mattered most. You spoke plain to the officers. No proud sprints, no broken files, and no night spent hunting shadows in a place that knew how to hide. A rider went off toward the flank to look for a way around a marshy patch, and a few steady hands took care of small repairs to straps and buckles. Men shared bread and a quick drink, and faces looked less tight, because work finished well always eased the chest. The fallen were set for careful carrying, and notes were made to send back to families, because duty did not end with the field. The day's light bent toward late, and plans for the next stage took shape with simple marks on the ground. A cool breeze brushed the cheek as the trees gave way to lower brush, and that touch felt like a promise that the road ahead could be held calm, which is how a day should end when the work had been honest. Chapter 7. Cavalry Pursuit at Dusk. Evening fell on the column as scouts came back with word that the foe had run from the last stand by the trees, and the men looked for a sign that the day would end. The thought moved across the ranks like a steady tide. Finish this now and let the camp rest. A quiet choice seemed best, so the riders were called forward and formed by habit, points closing toward the center for a sharp push. A standard bearer lifted the crimson vexillum, and the flag showed the way with no need for loud orders. That was the point of signs, after all. The guard closed around the command group, while the riders eased into place by pairs, each file keeping its space, each leader watching the line. A young officer asked if the chase should go long, but the answer stayed mild and plain, far enough to break the will of the rear, not so far that the line shattered in the dark. Calm lived in clear limits. An older rider nodded and touched a scar that had taught him the same lesson years ago. The wedge would go in, then fold back, and the foot would sweep the stragglers. A simple plan held best on a long day. The crimson vexillum caught a thin band of light along the west, and that one strip was enough to say it was time. The riders set off at a walk, then at a tight trot, and the shape of the wedge held true as if stitched with rope. A file on the right eased a little, and the guide checked it with a raised hand, then pointed again toward the gap the scouts had marked. A few steps more, and the pace changed, smooth and sure. The lead men kept their shields close to the knee, and let the horses move as they were trained, not wild, not too fast, ready to stop on the mark. That was the way to keep heads clear when heat tried to grab them. Behind, the second line kept a breath of space to keep the push strong without pressing too hard. There was no rush to shout or throw weight around. The point of order was to save the breath for the right stroke. The path opened across a gentle rise, and the ground looked firm enough for a short run at the rear of the broken band. Hoofbeats rolled together until they felt like one long line of drums, steady and sure, and that sound held men steady as well. As the wedge gained the rise, the back of the fleeing crowd showed in bits. A shield here, a hunched back there, nothing firm enough to turn and stand. A quiet signal flicked from the center, and two small groups peeled out to guard the flanks, while the point aimed for the largest knot ahead. There had been talk of traps all season, pits and brush and tricks, so no one drifted from the line to chase a single man. That sort of pride broke more lines than any enemy, and it was better to move as one. The command group followed a little behind, where choices could still be made with an open eye and a wide view. A comrade beside held a spare mount by the reins and said nothing. He knew the work as well as his own name. The ridge bent left, and the point of the wedge bent with it, simple as a finger turning a page. The lesson stayed the same as always: keep the edge sharp and cut across the path. Do not chase the end. A light wind pressed against cheek and jaw during the turn, just enough to mark the change, and it felt like a small nod that the knight waited but would not rush the work. The path dropped into scrub and a string of low hollows, each one ready to hide a rock or a root that could catch a hoof, so the point eased and then built its pace again. Riders in the second line drifted wide enough to see past the first. Not far, just a horse's length, so no gap could open on either side. A small knot of the foe tried to turn back toward the trees, but a left-hand group cut them off at an angle, and the whole shape of the chase slid forward like a door closing on a slow hinge. Orders passed with hand signs, a tilt here, a sweep there, easy to read, and all of it felt like old drill burned into muscle. The plan was firm and kind: catch them against the open ground, offer a way to throw down what they carried, draw a few out who tried to hold the rest, and shut that pocket before it widened. A rider near the point gave a low laugh when his horse found the clean line through a dip and climbed out without a slip, and the ease of it eased others. The smell of warm leather and horse rose close to the face in that narrow place, a simple, honest scent that had been a friend on many hard days. Ahead, the ground leveled into a broad stretch with a thin ribbon of water off to the right, and the broken band began to clump as if the field itself pressed them together. A pair from the second line swung wide to block the edge, and the rest tightened for the push. A reserve group held back to guard the path the wedge had made, because a rear that stayed clean spared long worry. The order was plain: give the front a moment to offer terms, then close if needed. A man at the back of the foe tossed his shield aside and ran, and others near him began to sag. One never knew which small thing would break a crowd like that. It might be no more than the sight of steady riders pointing in. A comrade at the shoulder asked if the far side should be sealed, and a nod sent another small group to cut the line near the water. That spared a longer chase through wet ground and poor footing. Grit found its way onto the tongue when a low patch of dry soil broke under the lead horses and sent a brief cloud across the front, and it tasted like the road had come inside for a heartbeat. There were still a few in the middle who tried to turn and hold their friends while the rest slipped away, and for a breath the wedge met them. The point checked just enough to keep the line even, and then the front rank moved in with clean strokes, the sort that came from years of drill. There was no lunge for glory, only the steady aim for wrists and grips and the edges of shields that kept a man upright. A small push with the knee moved a horse into a space where the angle was better, and the arm rose and fell without rush. The blade that hung at the hip most days did its work now, the spatha made for wide reach from the saddle, and it felt as ordinary in the hand as a pen in camp. Some of the foe threw down their gear, and gaps opened in the crowd. The hardest held a breath more, then stepped back. Calm orders brought the riders into two short lines to keep the pocket from bursting. The scrape of metal on wood came in short bursts as edges bit shield rims and slid off. One dry note after another, and that plain sound told its own story of a fight done by rule rather than rage. A raised arm called the halt, and the point eased away while the second line took the place to block a last sprint by those who still thought to run. A few men were sent to gather those who had given up and steer them toward the foot on the ridge, where hands waited with rope and a quiet word. Others formed a ring around a small knot of captives, so no fool stroke could fly in on fear. Names were taken. None of it needed to be loud. The first form of mercy in a field like this was to be certain and calm, and to make the order plain for all to see. The riders let their mounts breathe while they checked straps, and a few leaned forward to pat a neck for a job well done. A lone messenger went on to the river to say the worst was over, so the cooks could keep the fires steady. A man behind asked if the chase should go farther, but the answer was no, not tonight. One point of light showed above the rim of the west as the sky thinned, and that small star felt like a promise that the line had gone far enough. The riders turned back in good order, pairs closing up and space left where a mount was led for a friend who had taken a hard fall and needed an easy pace. The flag folded and sagged as the wind in the open ground dropped and the guide tucked it under an arm with care. The rear guard kept an eye on the edges as they passed the scrub, but nothing moved that needed a fresh push. A few quiet words passed between old hands about the ones who had let fear rule them tonight, and then the words faded, as such talk always did once the work was done. The ground of the rise showed the cuts of hooves like a map that would wash away with the next rain. There was talk of the camp by the water and the work that waited there, the usual talk that greased the mind back toward rest. The line let in the foot who had held the ridge, and a nod passed to them for the way they kept the door shut behind. It always mattered to praise simple holding. Heat from a small brazier at the rally point warmed the hands as men gathered to count heads, and that small comfort steadied more than one set of nerves. Chapter 8. Winter Quarters by the River. Winter quarters sat by the wide river, tucked behind a fresh wall and ditch. The legions settled into a slower rhythm that did not slacken, because steady hands mended what long marches had worn thin. You kept work moving without fuss, knowing idleness frayed thoughts faster than any blade. Each cohort took turns on the rampart, in the woodyard, and at the ovens, and a praetorian kept a calm watch by the main gate. The smell of stew rose from clustered fires as dusk came early, and men leaned in close to their bowls with thanks. Saturnalia drew near, and permission was given for song and small jokes, so long as the watch stayed firm. Tasks were set for each day of the week, and the lists were kept simple, so no one had to guess what came next. The river bend shielded one flank and gave clean water, and a new path was cut to the ferry place, because clear routes kept carts from breaking. Small courts settled minor quarrels in a corner of the camp street before the sun fell, and decisions were explained in ways the youngest could grasp. Officers met at second hour and again in late afternoon, and news from scouts went straight into those talks without show. Nothing grand filled those meetings, only care, and care was what an army needed after hard months. It was not a loud season, but it held the army together, which was the point. Order could live in calm as well as in battle, and rest, when guarded well, sharpened duty rather than dulled it. That was the way of things, and it set up all that came next. Work crews rotated through the broken parts of camp and put them right with plain tools and steady speed. The wall was lifted by hand, basket by basket, and the ditch was cleared so water ran where it should. Huts were patched with new turf and wattles, and gaps were chinked so walls held firm, because small flaws became big troubles when weeks ran long. In the yard a line formed to mend gear, and a leather worker stitched torn straps while a carpenter fixed split rims on a scutum without complaint. The ring of hammers on pegs carried across the ground in a slow beat, marking time better than any horn. Walkways were laid with brush and scrap so feet stayed out of mud, and the smith checked wheel bands before they were set back on. Ovens were scraped and shaped, and the bread crew learned to keep ash from spoiling dough, a trick old hands swore by. Latrine trenches were moved and marked, and orders about where to wash and where to draw water were read out again because health was discipline, not luck. A small work gang cut timber upriver and floated it down to the landing, and teams hauled it straight to where it was needed, without waste. A visitor could have thought this was dull, but it was the sort of dull that built a shield around everyone. No one rushed, and no one drifted, and that balance was what held fear away. When hands had work, and eyes had a simple task, the mind settled, and a man remembered who he served. That was the rule in any season, and it worked here. Morning drill kept the line sharp. Formations formed on the cleared parade ground, and signals were repeated until every file knew them in sleep. The pace began small, then quickened, then settled, because the body learned best by steady work. Targets were set at measured space, and the first ranks practiced the cast, then closed and shifted places with the second ranks, as they had on hard days north of the woods. A pillar marked from one call to the next, and then shields came up as bodies moved as one. White breath hung over the ranks like a thin cloud as the morning wore on, and it showed the count as well as any tally. The drill officer kept the voice even and never hurried the turnings, trusting the rhythm to set itself after so many months. Young soldiers learned to take a step with the throw and to stop their feet before closing, and older men corrected them and moved on. Files changed places by pair and then by four, and gaps were closed without thought, which was the fruit of long patience. Standards were posted by the far fence, so men learned to dress toward them, and the habit took hold the way good habits do. The drill ended with a short step past the gate and back, so feet did not forget the march. No one was asked for more than he could give, but no one was allowed to coast, and that was a fair line. The way of Rome was practice until thought and motion matched, and it still worked. Midday brought the slow parts that mattered most. Grain measures were counted out in front of witnesses, and the same hands checked the scales, so no question could grow in the dark. Pay advice was reviewed with the legate, and arrears from the last hard push were marked for the next allotment, since trust was built coin by coin. Couriers came in from the rear with notes about roads and snow, and the scribes took down replies in a steady hand. The faint scratch of a stylus on wax filled the tent, a thin sound that meant work was being done. When a century came up short on flour, the shortfall was traced to a sick mule and a broken axle, and men were moved to help fix both before sunset. Requests were heard for leave to visit a sick mother, or to send money home, and they were weighed with care, because mercy kept hearts strong in winter. A list of veterans due for discharge in the spring was checked line by line, and the dates were promised in clear words, so hope had a real shape. Fires were not lit inside during these hours, since clear heads did better in open space, and that had been learned long ago. When a case was hard, the senior officer spoke first, and judgment followed simply, with reasons set out so a man could accept them. That made the next day easier for all. Letters were sealed, baskets were loaded, and a messenger took the path south before the end of the day. This was not showy labor, but it kept the army whole, and that was enough. Evening brought Saturnalia, kept modest, so duty stayed tight. Caps were swapped as the old custom allowed, and a junior gave a mock order to a grinning elder, and that small turn brought grins. Wagers were tossed with knucklebones on packed earth, and a simple crown of green went round the fire by turns, a sign that rank could bend without breaking. The songs rose in verses that all knew from childhood, and the tune stayed steady from one fire to the next. A praetorian watched near the gate and did not join, and that kept the edge in place even as the men let their minds loosen. A longer watch was set on the far bank for those nights, and the men chosen for it took the change without a word, because trust ran both ways when joy was allowed. A little wine was issued and shared out by section, and the last drop went to the oldest in the file, which made the young grin. A memory of a lost friend sometimes rose, but it ended with a toast and a promise, and that was the right shape for grief among soldiers. When the hour came, the crown went back to the box, the games ended, and the jokes ended, and slow steps took men to their beds. This was not sin or folly, just a pressure valve set where it would not harm the engine. That was the emperor's choice, and it worked. The wounded were tended with the same calm pace. In a hut set for the purpose, the surgeon and his helpers checked bandages, cut away rot, and packed clean cloth where it would do good. A young recruit learned to hold a limb steady, and an old fighter taught him the trick of speaking plain, so fear did not run loose. The sharp smell of vinegar hung over the tables as tools were dipped and wiped, and it told every man the place was kept clean. Those who could sit up were set to small tasks, like mending a strap or trimming a peg, so hands stayed busy while skin knit. Some wounds were slow to mend, and patience was the only cure for them, and there was no shame in that. A few scars had set hard, and a short walk each day around the inner path was set as duty, so bodies did not lock with the long wait. Names were written down for a fresh cloak or a new shoe when the stores allowed, and a promise was made to make good by spring. Now and then the emperor stopped by and sat without pomp, and an arm was squeezed and a jest was shared that did not press too hard. The men in those beds were not forgotten, and that knowledge did most of the healing. A camp that cared like this kept its soul, and that was worth the time. Out on the rampart, the watch turned in steady pairs, and the hours were marked by measured steps. The river ran slow between iced edges, and scouts came and went with short reports about paths, snow, and the temper of nearby villages. No alarms were raised in those weeks, and the calm gave space to plan what should follow when the roads opened. The clean bite of frost on the face kept men alert without any extra urging, and it reminded all that nature set its own drumbeat. Maps were spread in the command tent, and markers were moved with care as the next moves were shaped with patience. Word was sent to the rear to ready gifts that might help a talk with chiefs across the water, because peace was earned step by step. A small team was chosen to study the meadow that would serve for a meeting, and questions were set for them to answer about lines of sight, paths in, and a good place for a guard to stand without threat. A draft of simple terms was written in plain words, firm without being hard, and room was left for face to be saved on both sides. None of this was glory, and none of it made a song, but it was the sort of work that kept sons and fathers alive, that was worth more than a line in a scroll. When the first days lengthened by a small turn, a light change passed through the camp and lifted heads. Stores were still watched because winter liked to surprise men who thought it was leaving, but the worst had been met with steady work. Gifts were stacked for the talk ahead, small things with meaning, and messengers carried safe words to those who would listen. The thin rise of smoke over the huts at first light drew a clean line above the roofs, and it marked time better than any calendar. The chief officers reviewed the plan for the meeting, set the number for the escort, and fixed the hour for a return, because leaving nothing to chance was how meetings stayed calm. A pledge was written to trade prisoners and bring back a few families taken in earlier months, and that paper was folded with care. Names of chiefs were learned and the order of seats was set, not out of vanity, but to keep tempers from tripping on small stones. A last tour of the lines was made without warning, and hands were thanked for steady duty, because praise landed best when it was plain. Then the camp settled again into its rhythm, and sleep came easy to most, as it should after honest labor. Morning would bring the first steps toward that meadow, and you would ask for peace with open hands. That was the next duty, and it would be met. Chapter 9. Parley on the meadow. The parley took place on a flat meadow by the river where the grass lay, bent from old frost, and a small table had been set between two lines of mounted guards who kept their spears lowered. The chiefs from across the water came in twos and threes, careful with their steps, each one glancing to see how far the horsemen stood. A coal pan burned near the table to keep hands from stiffening, and thin smoke from the small fire lifted and curled between words. You had asked for this meeting after Winter's Edge because you held that a quiet deal saved more lives than a quick blade, and that was the duty that stayed the longest. A clerk stood at your elbow with a wax tablet, and an interpreter waited with his eyes on the men who came. Pride was heavy on both sides, yet the day felt simple in a way that battle never did, and this was the surprise one learned on campaign. Men spoke of emperors as thunder, yet most of your work sounded like a neighbor's talk over a fence, and that was the truth of it. You had seen enough graves to know that plain words beat fine boasting, and patience kept men fed. So the meeting began with a nod, and the guards sat back in their saddles while the river slid past beyond them. The escort had been kept small on purpose, and the hostages for the talk were exchanged with care so that no man felt trapped, which was an old rule in these fields. One of your officers rode a slow circle to fix the space in his mind, then settled near the table with his hands open so that nobody felt pushed. The chiefs did much the same in their way, and their eyes kept counting the horses and the men and the slope down to the water, because numbers always wrote part of the talk. A few boys carried bundles behind the chiefs, and one had a staff tipped with a carving of a bird that likely meant something about their oath. The interpreter cleared his throat and waited, and that small sound felt like a man stepping into cold water, steady and expected. In battle, shape held the line. In a talk, it was the slow give and take that set the shape, and that was just as firm. You sat with your hands folded on the table, and the chief stood for a time and watched, and then one of them spoke first. The river gave a low, even hush that ran under every word, and it helped men keep their voices calm. Greetings were traded in formal phrases first, and then the interpreter carried the plain heart of the matter across the gap in slow steps, one sentence at a time. You named the dead you remembered from both sides, and let a pause sit there, and the men nodded because it was right to mark them. The chiefs told of their people, the winter spent close, the hunger that forced small raids, the fear of deep woods, and the threat of men farther north. You answered with the duty you carried, the wish to keep the roads open and the towns under the eagle from fear, and the need to stop the small fires before they spread. No charge was thrown, no insult given, and that made the day hold together. The meadow seemed to draw in around the table, as if even the horses leaned nearer to listen. A hawk turned slowly high above the open ground, and the sun caught on its wings as it circled. You kept your words short, so there would be no twist when they crossed through the interpreter, for that was always how clean talk stayed clean. It did not pay to sound grand in such moments. It paid to be clear, and that lesson had taken years to learn. When the greetings were done, you set out the terms as plain as bread and as steady as the table in front of you. The fighting would stop along the roads and at the river for the season, and all crossing would happen at 2 posted fords with Roman lookouts set near, so that there would be no surprise and no wild chase. The chiefs would bring back any prisoners they held, and would send word if strangers moved near the border. In return, grain would be set aside at the store by the bridge, and a fair share would reach their hungry huts, so that there would be no reason to steal. A small market day could be tried, and a few traders could pass under watch with safe conduct signs held high. You spoke of the red vexillum planted behind the chairs as a reminder that the day was bound by order, not by force, and one of the chiefs smiled at the sight as if he understood the point. A leather strap from a horse's harness creaked when a guard shifted his weight, and that small sound cut the quiet for a moment. It was a simple list to hear, but simple things were hard to keep, unless men truly wanted them, and there lay the real work. The chiefs drew back to speak among themselves, and the oldest of them tapped his stick on the ground while the others leaned in close. Their faces were long from winter, and their coats had been mended and mended again, which told you more than any complaint could. A young one frowned as if he thought you were asking him to bow his head, and a scar on his cheek pulled when he spoke to his elder. Their herald stepped forward with a caduceus held across his palms to show the talk was under its peace, and the elder nodded as if to say, "We have the right to speak plainly and live." It took time for the older man to bring the young ones around, but time was the cheapest cost on a day like this. Patience was part of command that nobody praised in songs, yet it did the most. When they came back, the elder asked that his people be left free to water their herds near the willow bend and to trade for salt and pots, so the small needs would not turn into theft. A soft breeze touched your cheek while he spoke, and it seemed to carry the weight of his request, light but steady. It was a fair ask, and fair asks were the ones a leader could meet. There were hard points too, and these came next because the shape of peace always had a stern edge. You pressed for all captives to be brought out within 3 days, with names spoken aloud before both sides so no one vanished without a trace. And the elder met you halfway by asking that his own taken sons and brothers be found and freed as well. One of your men spoke up to say that a group of boys had been found after the last fight, and he would ride to bring them if the road stayed safe. You added a small thing of your own. A few strong men could hire on with the scouts to learn the roads and earn pay, which would bring bread to their homes and teach them our ways. The young chief liked that. The interpreter repeated it back carefully, all the small words kept straight so that no man felt tricked. Then the clerk wrote the terms on the wax tablets, pressing the point in neat lines while he checked each line twice because clarity kept the piece from cracking. The smell of the warmed wax rose as the wooden stylus moved across it, clean and simple. It was good to see the shape of the deal take form under a hand rather than a sword. When both sides agreed in sense, the old rites came into play, as they always did in fields like this. A bowl of watered wine was set on the table, and each side spoke an oath before they tasted it, calling on the river to witness in its long, slow way, since the water had watched all these lands far longer than any of us. The elder laid his palm on his staff as he vowed, and you placed your hand on the table where the writing lay, thinking of all the men sleeping in camp who would wake to easier work because of this. It felt right to mark the moment with something shared, not costly, not grand, just passed from hand to hand. The young chief looked at the bowl for a breath, as if weighing what it meant, and then he nodded and drank. You lifted the bowl and took a small sip and set it back, plain and steady, because ceremony mattered only as much as men believed in it. The taste of the wine, thin with river water, sat on your tongue for a time. If a promise could be held by such simple acts, then it could be kept by simple acts too, and that was the lesson you hoped they would carry home. Gifts were exchanged in modest measure, as was the custom, not to buy favor, but to show good faith and to mark the clear end of danger for the day. A few sacks of grain were promised for the next morning, a handful of good tools for mending, and a pledge for safe path to the ford for their herds when the thaw came full. The chiefs offered skins and a carved horn for your table, plain things with careful work on them, and you took them with thanks because respect ran both ways if it was to run at all. Orders went out for the horsemen to hold steady for a while longer, and for the men in camp to stand down from the edge. The clerk sanded the tablets and tucked them away in a pouch, and the interpreter sat back as if he had set down a heavy pack. One of your officers joked with a guard about the long walk back and made a small sign for luck, and it loosened shoulders on both sides. You told the chiefs that a red cloth would be set on a pole by the ford when grain was ready, so there would be no confusion. A thin band of sunlight lay across the grass as the meeting ended, and the meadow looked softer for it. Peace was not a song, it was a habit, and habits began on days like this. Chapter 10. Letters Home and a Quiet Vow. The last light had slanted through the tent flap while the table waited with its neat stack of sheets, and the Aquila stood at the door as if it kept watch over every word. Time had been set aside, though it never came easy, and the hand moved slow because each line mattered more than a shout on the field. Losses were marked first, then small mercies, because that order felt honest and kind. Names were written with care, and a short line followed on how each man had stood, and who would be told, and what the household would receive. The day's work in the camp had been simple enough, and that gave courage to the tone, for steady routine held soldiers together better than pride. The sun warmed the parchment under the hand and made the ink dry in an even way, which was a small gift at the end of a long season. It had been true that promise weighed more in the quiet than in noise, and that was the way of things. A vow had gone down clean. More steady days would be carved out, if the river and the hills allowed it. Fate had its own steps, but choices were still choices, and a leader lived by them. Drafts had been scratched first on wax, because clear thought liked a place where error could be tidied with a thumb, and the letters for Rome deserved clean edges. The point of a stylus had moved like a plough across a short field, and lines had turned and returned until the shape of the letter felt sound. A scribe had waited a little way off with a calm face and a patient way of holding his board, and he had known the habit by now, which spared words. The text had grown into simple phrases, not proud words, because families cared for truth more than glory. It had been told how the winter had been met, how the bridge had held, how the men had laughed at a small joke last night, and how a cheek had steadied a younger one after a hard march. The scratch of the stylus on the warm wax had been steady, like a man working a familiar furrow, and it kept the mind even. Draft after draft had tuned the tone from hard to kind, for that was the road worth walking. When the sense felt right, the copy to parchment began without haste, as calm work always did. The list of the dead had then been read again, and the breath had been held between each line to give a little space for respect. There had been no show in the words sent to their homes, only the facts of how a man had stood and what had been done for his fellows when it counted. The clerk had noted which village would see the letter first, and the courier detail had been named without fuss or delay. It had been set down that pay owed would be sent, that grain would be given, that a plot would be secured if the family needed it, because duty did not end at the edge of a camp. A small part had told of a token sent with the message, a button, a piece of wood, a few dry words on how it had been found, for people liked to touch what a sun had touched. The smell of slow pine smoke from the brazier had hung low in the tent while each name passed, and it made the place feel like a homeroom for a time. That gentled the hand. Loss had been a true part of command, yet it did not have to be a cold part that had been learned in hard years. A letter to the household had come next, and it had been written in the voice that belonged at the family table, not on a field. It had told of small things first, because small things kept fear from growing large. A mended boot that held water out at last, a cook who salted the stew just right, a soldier with a quick joke that made the lads grin with shy pride. A line had told of a game of knucklebones that ended in good cheer, and of the small garland kept from Saturnalia to remind the men of city streets and easy days. It had asked about lessons, and about a garden vine that never quite took in the last year, and about the neighbor who always argued but never failed to help when it counted. A note had assured that night watches were strong and that the river ice had thinned as hoped. It had been right to keep that tone, for those at home needed steadiness more than news. The taste of watered wine had touched the tongue between lines and made the mouth easy for words that might have stumbled. That simple drink brought the mind to ground. With that steadiness, hope had been given without trying to sell a dream. A plain report had then been set in order for the city, and it had been built with clear steps because men far away needed to see the ground by words alone. The roadworks had been told of in simple counts, and the river path had been marked as safe enough for carts if the next week stayed dry. No fine talk had covered the weak points, for truth was better than paint when winter still pressed on the bones of the land. The letters had asked for nothing grand, only for time and the freedom to place cohorts where streams and fields said they should stand, though titles and forms had been kept neat to honor the order of things. It had been explained how a quick strike would waste men and how patience would tighten peace. The rough grain of the table had pressed into the palm while the sign was set at the end, and that touch had reminded that plans were built on simple wood and simple will. People liked big words, but it had been known that steady hands beat loud mouths. A report made in plain lines held better in the minds of those who must choose. When the last mark had dried, a quiet step had carried the body outside to the edge of the tent street, where the ground fell toward the dark river. The air had felt still, and the guards had stood at their posts with easy shoulders, and a few men had moved toward the cook fires in pairs without hurry. There had been room at last to think of what the meadow had started and what the next thaw might bring. Talks had bent pride for both sides, but the hills kept long habits, and it had been no secret that worry would return if hungry mouths rose with spring. A myth had called emperors born to command, but the truth had been seen in the way a hand shook sometimes after a hard message was sent or a quick mercy was given. It had been learned that the work of calm had to be done each day, not once for all time. The hush of the river had moved in a slow, patient way, like a beast at rest, and it passed along a soft promise that time could smooth rough edges. That sound had steadied the breath. The will to keep peace had not been a soft thing. It had been a choice made again and again. Back inside, the wax had been warmed for seals, and the stacks had been tied with plain cord, each packet marked for its rider with a small stroke. The signet had left its mark one by one, and care had been taken not to rush, for haste broke more than it saved. The men who would carry the news had been called by name, and each had been given a short parting line, not to stir pride, but to remind them to ride clean and rest their horses in fairness. Some packets had been set aside for the city, some for small towns, and some for fields that had never seen a wall, which was the true reach of the work. The thought had come that words traveled farther than steel, and often lived longer. A thin bead of red wax had pooled under the stamp's face and settled round and glossy, and it had caught the eye for a moment like a small sun at rest. That one sight had been enough to mark the end of the night's task. Every seal had turned a thought into a duty, and duty into a path. That had been the way to make a season turn out right. When the packets had gone to the courier tent, the body had stood easy again by the table, and the mind had set a last line down that no secretary could write. It had been a vow made without show, because quiet words sat deeper than loud ones. The line had promised not triumph, but steadiness, and not fame, but fairness, and it had asked for strength to choose the plain road when the bright one tempted. This war had taught that mercy kept men from hard choices more often than iron did, and that had been worth more than any shout from a parade. The Aquila by the door had seemed to watch, though it was only bronze and memory, and it reminded that all honor was carried by many hands. The cool night air had touched the face when the flap was lifted again, and it had felt like a small blessing after hot days and tight hours. That small touch had set the heart at ease. Letters would ride now, and with them days would turn. Peace would need guarding, as always, and the work would start again at dawn. And so, our time with the Emperor on campaign draws to a close. The legions return to their tents, the fires burn low, and the sound of marching feet fades into silence. Until our next story together. Rest well, dream deep, and good night.